Navia is getting her first rerun in Genshin Impact, and in this video we're going to cover everything new since her release, talk about whether or not you should get her, and how to make the most out of her if you do. We're also going to talk about the state of Geo in Genshin Impact, whether Fontaine may have improved it by adding the 2 new Geo 5 stars that they did, and the surprising places that Hoyo very well might take Geo in the future. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. We're going to start with a lightning round updated build guide because it hasn't changed at all. You still want to level 90 her, although it's not as important as other Geos like Ito. You absolutely want to max out her talents, starting with skill, then her normal attack, then her burst. For me, Navia was worth crowning because her damage is all skill damage. I think 10.98 or 10.99 is a good stopping point. If you don't have the resources, you can wait to crown her skill. For weapons, the Verdict is her best, but it's not by very much. Serpent Spine is very, very close, especially at R5, especially with Bennett, but Serpent Spine is an absolute pain in the ass to use, so I don't blame you if you want to go for something else. Wolf's Gravestone not that far off, Beacon is not that far off, and the free-to-play Ultimate Overlord's Mega Magic Sword is not as far off from other weapons, especially given that it gives you some energy recharge and a high base attack. It ends up being about 17 to 20% less than her signature, which is a pretty small amount considering it's a craftable weapon, but the axe has the best drip in the game, so that's personally what I like to go for. Her constellations are some of the weaker constellations, especially for Fontaine units. Generally not recommended going for. Better to go for C2 Farina or something like that. For artifacts, you'd want attack, Geo, crit. The Nighttime Whispers in the Echoing Woods is her best set if you're using Farina. Marchese Hunter is very close. You can use two-piece attack if you don't want to farm her set, but because she scales off of raw damage, any damage stat increase you get is going to be valuable, so the 10 to 12% upgrade for this set over others, for me, is worth farming. But if you're not willing to like truly main Navia and you just want to use her for fun, a two-piece. Team building is basically going to be Navia, Geo, Flex, with the Flex being non-Geo characters. You generally want a Geo character to provide more Geo energy, to provide more crystallized shards. As you probably know, Navia's damage is almost entirely based around creating crystallized shards and consuming them with the use of her skill. So having a second Geo character to provide off-field Geo damage is very important in maxing out her skill damage, but both her passives and just the lack of really strong Geo characters and the need for crystallize makes you really want the other 2 characters to be non-Geo so that they can provide crystallize and give her more attack through her passive. The Geo characters you can use are Zhongli, which is generally considered the overall best considering his comfort. However, a lot of his damage is based on proccing the tenacity of the Millith artifact set, and sometimes, you know, your pillar gets destroyed, it doesn't summon in the first place, it's too far away, and it's not consistently hitting the enemy. This can really hurt his geoparticle amount. It can also hurt the uptime on the tenacity buff, and in that case, someone like Chiori she already is slightly higher damage than Zhongli, but her consistency and her consistent crystallizes, because if your pillar is not close, it's not creating crystallizes. So although on paper it's a very small increase for Chiori over Zhongli, in practice I have found noticeable clear times that were faster with Chiori because of the increased crystallize. The better you built your Navia, the better Zhongli is, considering he provides that additional Geo shred, but at least through the consistent crystallizes you'll get from Chiori, you will be having the Geo resonance buff the vast majority of the time. So personally, I prefer Chiori if you happen to have her, but if you don't, I don't recommend really wishing for her just for Navia, unless you're going for her C1. This is honestly one of the scummiest things I think Hoyo has ever done, releasing Chiori so soon after Navia. And I was a bit blinded by my love for Chiori's design and my desire to use her with Navia, and the fact that it is an overall upgrade for Navia. But the fact that the upgrade is so small and the upgrade from the C1 is so big, it's not a doubling of damage, by the way, for Chiori, because she does a lot of damage through her passive, so the additional doll doesn't double her damage. It's about 1.6, something closer to that. But it's something that I really don't like that Genshin did, and it's definitely bait to make you go for C1 Chiori. If you do, it is a very nice upgrade, but if you don't want to go for a C1, then just getting Zhongli, as he's much more universal, is a good idea. especially since it does make the Navia team much more comfortable. If you happen to not have Chiori and not have Zhongli, Albedo is a solid pick, but you should never wish for Albedo for your Navia team. You should never wish for Albedo for meta reasons at this point, because Chiori is always better in every circumstance. But Albedo is fine here, but he does have slightly lower damage, as well as his flower has the propensity to being destroyed, so there's really no reason to use Albedo over Chiori. But if you have him, he's not that much worse, especially if you cannot let his flower get destroyed. Noelle is not recommended as the final Geo, but both Ning Wang and Geo Traveler are pretty good for this slot. If you've been looking for an excuse to use your Ning Wang, this could very well be the place. Not going to be as good damage as with Zhongli or Chiori, but she's pretty consistent, she's pretty fun, she's pretty bursty. Very single target for her burst. Still a solid pick. And Geo Traveler is going to be giving his crit rate buff, as well as Geo Resonance, as well as all that stuff. So he does have a place. He's potentially better than Ning Wang. I've in practice found they're about the same. You can choose whoever you prefer. So that's your Geo slot. The Geo slot will always be consistent. Every Navia team will have a Geo slot, at least the Navia teams that I would recommend. You can use whatever, of course, but in terms of high performance, I prefer the second Geo for more crystallizes. Your energy needs are just absolutely off the charts if you don't, and she just doesn't get as much crystallizes. And the other two slots are basically flex. I really like Bennett flex. So Bennett Shengling is really good. Shengling provides lots of crystallizes, some decent off-field damage. You need lots of ER on her, but I find this really good. But I also like Bennett Yai, especially for an abyss like this where you need electric, and just for single target in general. Bennett Yai, Bennett Fischl, Bennett Farina, Bennett Yelan, all of these are really good. Just sort of depends what you have available and what elements are best for the abyss that you're fighting. If you're fighting in this particular abyss on the second side, then you'll probably want to use Yelan for that extra hydro. And you can also swap out Bennett for a different healer. You can use Sijuin. Unfortunately, Sijuin doesn't actually buff Navia's on-field skill, because Sijuin only buffs off-field skill, but she is buffing Farina, so at least there's that. By the way, for Farina teams, I tend to prefer Chiori a little bit more than Zhongli, because Farina is also buffing the second on-field DPS. But yeah, Sijuin. You can also do Charlotte, especially if you build Charlotte with an ungodly amount of ER and have Thrilling Tales. Very hard to do, but if you can pass the Thrilling Tales to Navia, and that can make up at least a little bit for the fact that you're not running Bennett. I don't really recommend the other healers here, but if you do run Zhongli, then you can run dual off-field DPS like Fischl Yai or Fischl Yelan or something like that. I don't like it all that much, but I guess you don't have to play in Bennett's circle. But I feel like if you don't want to play in Bennett's circle, you're best off using what I would consider the overall best Navia team, and that is Shenhe Plunge. I like this team a lot for a couple of reasons. One is you're not tied to Bennett's circle at all, and two, the AoE is much better. Navia's skill has a property where it doesn't have true AoE. It splits the damage among the enemies that it hits. So that's why she's generally much more of a single target DPS. But Shenhe giving her the ability to plunge and buffing her plunge attacks make her AoE so much better. Plunge attacks from Claymores have a huge AoE. They're really easy to execute, and this team makes her much more of a versatile DPS. I have had faster clears in single target with Bennett teams, but the overall consistency, and because the Abyss isn't just like a single target test dummy and it's an actual chamber with rooms and movement and stuff like that, I definitely overall prefer the Shenhe team as my favorite team. And because Shenhe and Farina is such a strong core anyways, this doesn't hurt to have. So I definitely would recommend wishing for these two characters if you want to maximize your Navia. I also wanted to remind you to play to the Abyss that you're in, although I generally would never recommend Bennett Kazuha as a core for a Navia team. If you're playing an Abyss that's highly good for Kazuha and just like a Kazuha Abyss, I have had really good clears with Bennett Kazuha, and Kazuha's burst is the one creating crystallize on this team. So you definitely have to make sure that he has enough ER for his burst to be up. And because Navia doesn't require a ton of field time and her infusion is not tied to staying on field, you can easily swap off of her, do a quick skill with Kazuha to regroup the enemies, and then back to Navia. Again, I'm not saying that this is like a great Navia team or something, but during the Abysses that Kazuha was really good, I have found this team to be quite useful and something just to get your creative juices flowing, that you don't always want to just pick the most optimal team, and sometimes you want to play to the Abyss itself. For rotation tips, sometimes you'll be able to get 3 skills on the first rotation by the way her skill cooldown is, and that can increase her front-loaded damage a lot. And because she has really good damage in general, you will often be able to burst down the chamber in the first 1 or 2 rotations, which will definitely make use of her more front-loaded damage, so keep in mind of that. I think there's like tips that I could give regarding like making sure you always have crystallized shields and creating crystallized shields, but like it's sort of something that's fairly intuitive that you'll just pick up as you play the character. Like you just want to make sure that you're keeping an eye out for the crystallizes around, especially with your other characters or as you're dashing. Her main combo when you're not using plunge is normal 2 and then dash 1 2 dash 1 1 2 dash 1 2 dash. I do like using her N3 dash, but it's technically less optimal, but it is super cool, ain't it? With the big kicking, with the kick of the axe. So sometimes I do the N3 if I'm feeling spicy, but the N2 is generally considered her best. And for plunge Navia, you're able to get, and for plunge Navia, you get 1 2 3 4. You can get, I believe it's 4 plunges if you're really tight on the timing, so you just have to practice. I found it pretty pain on mobile, but it's still doable after I got used to it. I really hated it at first, and then I got a bit more used to it, and it was not that bad. If you can only get 3 Geo plunges, it's still fine, but it's definitely better if you can get 4. It's more damage, it's more crystallized, and it's a lot more AoE. And this is the main reason why I recommend leveling up her normal attack over her burst. Outside of the Shenyun team, the burst and normal attack are pretty equal in terms of damage, but given Shenyun, the normal is definitely the way to go. For pros and cons versus others, value, power, etc., I like to start with that she's a lot better of a single target DPS than she is in AoE, but she is a decent AoE DPS given the fact that if you have the plunge team. I also really like that her damage is tied to her skill and not to her burst, which means that it's like totally fine if at the end of the chamber you want to use an extra skill to finish off an enemy. Like normally that feels like a thing that you have to do for a burst, but actually using the skill generates more energy, so you actually do want to unload your skills at the end of a chamber. So I really like that. I like how flexible her teams are. It's very nice to have a character that, like, not only does she have the Bennett teams, but the Shenyun teams, and the Shenyun team is a bit more restrictive in terms of the characters it wants. Like, it really wants Farina, but the Bennett teams can use any Geo and any other character. So overall, she's got lots of different options. I really like that. In terms of power, she definitely doesn't reach the heights of someone like Novelette or Arlecchino in terms of raw power. And even obviously, I know that technically on paper Linny also matches Arlecchino and Novelette in terms of power, but I find it much harder to actually practically achieve that than I do for Novelette and Arlecchino. And I find that Navia is just very simple and intuitive to play, and you can pretty easily get some really good damage out of her, especially with the plunge team. It's just very consistent, and as a result I find that her power reaches somewhere on the level of Zhao, Wanderer, Clorand, Alhaitham, Nilou, Hu Tao. Like it's somewhere on the level of these characters. Maybe the peaks are a bit lower, but the fact that she's so consistent and so flexible, I would personally put her on that level. I wouldn't say, like, again, I would say if you're looking for peak meta, you know, yeah, she's probably not as good as Hu Tao. But if you consider consistency and comfort, it's really cool the fact that she uses Zhongli and doesn't really have a damage loss for it, at least not versus C0 Chiori. So I would definitely recommend Navia to someone who wants a DPS and likes Navia and likes her playstyle. She's one of the most fun and satisfying characters to use, in my opinion. I think she has the potential to age very well, which I'll talk about in the later sections. In terms of value, for a DPS, I think she's pretty reasonable, like pretty reasonably high value. Like she's obviously not as high value as the good supports, as Farina and Kazuha and Yelan, etc. But versus other DPS, like I think she's pretty good. Value to me for a DPS comes with their flexibility, and since you have free-to-play Geos, you have Bennett Shanglang as a free-to-play core, that already sets her at a pretty decent spot. And then since a lot of people have Zhongli, you basically have a peak team right off the bat. And then if you do go for Farina Shenyun, that's another really good free-to-play core, like a good core that's good for free-to-play. It's not a free-to-play core, but it's a core that like is very recommendable to people. And then if you're using these two with her, then Bennett's freed up for the other side, your Dendros are freed up for the other side. So I think by using two really high value good core characters, teams, archetypes, and freeing up Dendro for the other side, or freeing up either Farina or Bennett for the other side, I think for a DPS she has a decent bit of value. Being only single target primarily hurts a little bit if you don't have the Frina Shenyun team for more AoE. So she's not like the first DPS that I'd recommend. That would obviously be Novelette as the most valuable DPS, but I still think Navia is in a pretty good spot versus the other ones. I think a lot of people look at her like raw base damage numbers and don't consider how easy it is to actually achieve her maximal potential and how flexible she is and stuff like that. So I think that's where people end up underrating Navia. Also remember, I'll be putting my official tier list out just next week where you'll be able to see exactly where I place Navia, so make sure to subscribe for that. On the whole, she's definitely not a character I'd recommend to people for meta reasons, but if you find her fun and satisfying, I would never dissuade you from getting her. She's a great pick. And like, don't take it personal that I wouldn't recommend very many characters, very many DPSs at all from a meta perspective. It's basically like, I don't recommend you get DPSs from a meta perspective at all. You should get the ones you like. Supports, I do recommend getting the meta supports, but DPSs, get the ones you want. So what about the future of Geo? Fontaine did a really weird thing when it came to Geo. They made a Geo DPS that's basically not a Geo DPS. I mean, she is, but Geo has been, at least for a while, focused on defense, focused on mono Geo, and Geo is in a really weird place at the moment. It was in a really bad place before. Ito is one of the more underwhelming DPSs at this point in the game, at least for me. Albedo has been completely power crept by Chiori. Zhongli has seen a complete resurgence, and he is in the best spot he's ever been. I think that Fontaine like saved Zhongli, to be honest, with characters like Novelette, Arlecchino, Navia, Linny, still Hu Tao, Zhao still, Zhao not as much, but still lots of characters using Zhongli. Alhaitham for his spread teams. Zhongli is a very, very good pickup nowadays in terms of comfort in general, and you don't lose that much damage and you gain incredible comfort by having Zhongli with a lot of top teams. So Zhongli's in a great spot, but Geo in general, like General Goro, very strong character, but only good on the Ito teams, which personally I find underwhelming. The Ito teams did get an upgrade through Chiori. Chiori makes the team noticeably better, but I still find the team noticeably underwhelming. The Chiori Zhongli core is okay, but it feels very like pre-Sumeru levels of okay. Like, it feels solid. Like, you can slot the double Geo team onto it, double Geo core onto the team. Like, double Geo with Linny feels pretty solid, but it's not great. Like, it's not something I would recommend. The fact that Chiori doesn't buff and that her damage isn't enough to just carry the core all by itself, considering that Zhongli, well, considering the characters that Chiori is generally replacing on the team are very powerful, like Yelan or Farina. Like, Chiori has such steep competition for off-field DPS, and for her max potential, needing a character, not only an off-field Geo character, but a character with a Geo construct. I don't think it's complete doom and gloom for Chiori, because I think that the future of Geo has some potential, like, but basically they've got to be willing to power creep Ito. Their choices were to make Chiori way overtuned so as to make the Ito team still good and bring it up to a really good level, but she wasn't overtuned enough for that. So now what they have to do is make other Geo DPSs that are stronger and that also have constructs to activate Chiori. It seems to me like Hoyoverse is going down two future roads with Geo. One where they just make Geo characters that are just essentially physical characters. Like, that's what Navia kind of is. She's a Geo character, but not a real Geo character. And that Geo, if Geo's thing was supposed to be using other Geos on the team, like, yeah, she needs one other Geo, but other than that, you don't want any more. So they've got this one path where that's sort of like Geo normies and then Geo construct defense type characters. And outside, like, potential future proofing for Imaginary and Theater, I don't see that much reason to get any Geo characters outside of Zhongli. Like, you get Zhongli for the elemental application if you ever need a Geo check, and you get him for the comfort. But outside of that, like, why really get a Geo character? Like, Navia, sure, she's a Geo character and she's a good DPS, but again, not a meta pull, and she's not good because she's Geo. I could see another crystallized support. Maybe the more crystallizes you pick up, the more damage a character does, and that will actually be Navia's best future team. That could be pretty cool. A character like an off-field DPS that specifically focuses on crystallizes could either work with Navia or have anti-synergy with Navia, depending on how they decide to do it. An on-field DPS, well, she's already an on-field DPS that does damage with crystallizes, like a buffer. I was thinking that there could be a Geo character, I talked about it in one of my Natlin speculation videos, how they could have like Archaic Petra, the artifact set. I don't actually think I have any Archaic Petra right now. I need to strongbox for it. But Archaic Petra basically gives a damage bonus for whatever type of crystallized shield it picks up. And it's a pretty substantial bonus and definitely one that you want to have for your account. Don't be like me and actually get a set. And so I was thinking they could make kind of Archaic Petra the character, and that could be a pretty cool rainbow Geo character. They could make Geo characters that specifically interact with specific elements. So there's like Navia to me represents the creative side of Geo, which I think is a valid side. Like, I know I've been calling them not real Geo characters, but I don't really like that. I would like to see more creative stuff. I think there's a lot of creative stuff. Like, what if a Geo character that specifically wants to work with Hydro characters and has a specific reaction with Hydro and then buffs Hydro characters because of that reaction? Like, I think that'd be really cool, and I think Geo is an element that could get away with doing something like that. And like a Geo Dendro character, I think that there's a lot of potential for more creative Geo type characters. And then maybe you end up running like a Geo Electro character where they have a specific reaction that buffs Electro. You could use Navia with that other Geo character and then double Electro, and that would actually be like a really good team. That would actually be so sick. So I think Navia represents like the creative side for Geo, and then Chiori represents the standard side for Geo, where we make defense scaling construct characters. And I think like maybe a Geo DPS that power creeps Ito, and that does, I think Jeff has said this, that does more damage the more constructs you have. So Chiori would have her 2 dolls. I don't know if that counts as 2 constructs, but then maybe you have Zhongli with his construct, then you've got Goro, and then all together it's just a power creep of Ito because of all the constructs you have. That would be kind of cool and interesting, but there's a more limited way that you can go because you only have so many team slots. Because you're almost always in a team like this, you generally want to have Zhongli because you don't have crystallized, but you still need a Geo shield to have Geo resonance. You still need a shield to have Geo resonance. Doesn't matter if it's a Geo shield, but you still end up wanting Zhongli. And then they just made Chiori, so presumably you're gonna want Chiori on a team like this. And then you generally want Goro because he buffs crit damage and defense. So the team is already set. We're just missing like a DPS. And what if they don't want to power creep Ito? Then they're really stuck and you need to almost replace Zhongli on the team, but that's kind of weird. So I feel like Genshin has a lot of potential for the creative Geo route and not a lot of potential for the construct route, unless I'm just not thinking of something. I just feel like what they've set up for themselves really is very limiting in terms of what they can do. But Genshin as a team has always been very creative, and they've always come up with new types of stuff that I haven't thought of before. Sometimes. And then sometimes with Chiori, they just did not cook, in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your ideas for Geo in the future. See you in the next one. Take care. Bye for now.